Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today. I'm excited to be joined here with Pantera as we discuss how organizations can use our solution to help measure resilience against the continually evolving threat landscape. Specifically speaking, we're going to look at how CynergisTek and Redspin, a division of CTEC, partners with Pantera and can help organizations evaluate technical controls using a ransomware scenario, which is unfortunately all too familiar in today's environment. My name is Ben Denkers, and I'm the Chief Innovation Officer here at CynergisTek and Redspin. I've spent the last 20 years in security consulting, helping organizations mature security and privacy programs with the goal of achieving security resilience. With me today, I have Nelson Santos from Pantera. Nelson, why don't you give a quick introduction?
Sure thing. So I'm Nelson Santos. I'm a senior sales engineer here at Pantera. Previously, I worked with everything from security automation to blue teams, red teams, pen testing, emergency response teams, and every aspect of security. And I'm really excited to be here today with CynergisTek.
Appreciate it, Nelson. Thanks so much. The challenge. So let's talk a little bit about the challenge. I think everyone would agree that there's really no such thing as 100% security. And even if that was achievable, the trade-offs would probably outweigh the benefits in most cases, right? So what do organizations do against threats like ransomware? They need to continuously evaluate their effectiveness on how they identify, respond, prevent, and most importantly, maintain resilience against those threat actors. What do these brands have in common? Pretty easy question, right? As of last month, I think there were over 100 plus reported attacks related in ransomware in the US alone. No industry is really left safe and in the clear. It probably comes as no surprise that these organizations have had their businesses disrupted because of ransomware. The cost of recovery can also be astronomical. In the case of several of these on the screen, it was in the tens of millions of dollars, right? And so as we start to think about how this affects organization, it becomes a very large problem, especially that cost of recovery. We want to front load as much as we possibly can on the preventative side so that we're not put in a situation where we are left with having to deal with the outcome of ransomware. Undoubtedly, though, that these organizations had technology to help prevent or at least identify some of these threat actors. So why did they still become compromised? From our perspective, generally we find that even with large technology budgets, rarely have those safeguards been implemented properly. Often this leads to kind of a false sense of security as it relates to those organizations. They start to feel as though they are prepared when in reality they're not, right? And so this can kind of cause long-term effects as organizations tend to feel they're in a better position than they are. If we specifically look at healthcare and leveraging our annual report, we find that most organizations don't even fare well against something like NIST cybersecurity framework. We found that when we evaluate the effectiveness of controls, that usually severe misconfigurations exist. These gaps, whether in auditing or alerting or even prevention, are often spread across people, process, and technology. If we look at kind of the upper half of this bar graph, and looking at kind of the top performers, they are consistently evaluating and validating that what they have in place is working as designed. I think this is a really key concept, right, as it relates to kind of that preventative mindset. We believe, from a synergistic perspective, that understanding the offensive playbook and continually testing weaknesses helps identify where those potential pitfalls are. And it really allows an organization to make adjustments as they need to limit the exposure to things like ransomware. Ransomware isn't going anywhere. That probably doesn't come as a surprise to most of the audience here. And I like to say, follow the money, right? And in this case, we're talking billions, and depending upon which article you read, trillions by 2025. Ransomware really isn't going anywhere. It's honestly just going to get worse. And what really complicates this is the fact that insurance organizations are also starting to pull out of the game as it relates to cyber insurance. So at some point, cyber insurance is going to be out of the reach for most organizations to even have their ability to offset some of this cost or risk as a potential safeguard. And so really this is going to be just another reason to have a mechanism in place to continually test controls and attack methods. And honestly, this is where the Pantera and CynergisTek combination come in great. So ransomware used to be kind of this drive-by spray and pray type scenario. If the customer isn't vulnerable to XYZ variant, then move on. This is really no longer the case, right? We're continually seeing cases of human-operated campaigns that utilize multi-pronged approaches to not only ensure the attack is successful, but maximize the pain and effectiveness. Another interesting trend that we're seeing is that the use of zero-day exploits as a point of entry has been increasing. This often means that your endpoint solution or equivalent safeguard is going to have an even harder time stopping and identifying the threat. So in an assumed breach scenario, an organization is required to understand what the internal attack chains exist, those routes that can potentially be used to escalate privileges, and how all vulnerabilities really interrelate, I should say. And you need to do this continuously, as you can imagine, this attack surface changes often daily. You can't see or stop the first domino as it relates to something like a zero-day attack. But the question is, how can you even see the second domino or third, or at what point as an organization do you realize that those dominoes are even falling over? And that's kind of what we're seeing as a trend with ransomware. Next slide. As you can see by this chart, the revolution, or rather evolution, of ransomware is also changing. Threat actors are gaining confidence as more organizations are paying, and a lot more in the sense of dollar amounts. When something works, more people jump on the bandwagon. What I find even more concerning is that the threat actors are actively starting to recruit internal employees with the promise of a cut of the profits. So imagine your attack surface now changing to potentially any one of your organization's users launching or initiating this type of attack for a share in the profits. And to me, that is what potentially becomes a very scary situation very quickly. And so what does a ransomware attack look like today, right? Really, the goal is to find any way to get in. It's no longer, like I mentioned previously, at first you don't succeed, move on. It's you try again, right? And so we're seeing multiple attack paths being used in order to get that initial compromise. From there, initial access usually isn't enough. Exploiting internal vulnerabilities or hard to see attack chains allows an attacker to then escalate privileges to gain some sort of, escalated privileges as it relates to moving laterally within the organization or gaining access to that critical data. Another trend we're seeing is they're actively seeking to limit your ability as an organization to recover. So this includes things like disabling backups or something similar, where your only choice is going to be, once they encrypt, is to obviously pay the ransom. From there, you're talking about the encryption and the offering of ransom, right? And so, as you've gone through this step, they now have data that they've stolen or pillaged. They have the ability to encrypt all of your files, and they're doing whatever they possibly can to make it as difficult as possible for you to actually recover. And so what's the end result? Well, for a lot of organizations, this means that they have no other choice other than to pay the ransom. And so ultimately, this could be, in some cases, tens of millions of dollars that are being, that these organizations are being profited on and paying off every single year. Next slide. Technology safeguards, as it relates to kind of this ransomware defense lifecycle, aren't enough as they are consistently failing. Organizations really need the ability to test tools, techniques, and procedures of threat actors so that they can really be proactive in identifying weaknesses within the organization, and specifically in the defensive structure that you guys have in place. Visibility on that potential attack chain is often only a few layers deep, as is the case with vulnerability scanning, for example, right? So you have Nessus, Rapid7, Qualys, they'll tell you that a server has a vulnerability. and that it's potentially exploitable. But what they don't do is necessarily tell you what happens if that vulnerability is used in conjunction with 3 other things, right? Or what the end result could potentially be. And so it's only surface deep and it only goes so far. So understanding and testing how these identified risks can be used provide a much different risk profile versus the output of any single tool, like an SS or equivalent. Knowing how ransomware, or any attack for that matter, works in the organization's environment gives ample opportunity to evaluate where corrective changes need to be made across your people, process, and obviously technology. So let's talk about a little bit about our partnership with Pantera. So Pantera provides, and our red team really help provide oversight on a continuous basis to help evaluate where organizations need to make adjustments in priority based on risks identified. And so CynergisTek leverages Pantera, CynergisTek and Redspin obviously leverage Pantera as a part of this process to effectively give you the ability to continuously monitor for these types of attack chains. Next slide. So at CynergisTek and Redspin, I would say our mission is really to help build resilience into security programs. And we do this by helping organizations prepare for the inevitable. As I mentioned at the beginning, nobody's going to be 100% secure. And so what we want to do is put up a good enough defensive posture where we can be resilient against whatever comes our way, knowing that something is absolutely going to come our way. Our clients typically needs are changing, as you can imagine, and to help organizations be better prepared for and prevent things like ransomware, we turn to Pantera, right? Pantera provides us with the capability to test for various attack chains and evaluate, how organizations do against various attacker tools, techniques, and procedures. And having that kind of offensive mindset and being able to do it routinely, I think, is very important. Pantera and our red team are continuously looking for those potential gaps that are hard to see without knocking down those dominoes we talked about earlier. If I was going to use like any example, gardening, for instance, right? Pantera plus CynergisTek really allows you to manage kind of those pesky weeds continuously throughout the year versus waiting, one time a year to go it and having a much larger problem. And so with that, I think we'll jump right into kind of what the solution really looks like. And I'll turn it over to Nelson, who will give you kind of a feel from a technical perspective on what it looks like to evaluate ransomware using the Pantera platform.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ben. Next slide, please. So I'll talk a little bit about the solution, so what Pantera does and how it tightly integrates with CynergisTek's red team oversight. And then I'll do actually a demo and show what the ransomware ready feature of Pantera looks like. But again, both the red team oversight, what CynergisTek does and what Pantera do, it goes way beyond just ransomware. Next slide, please. So historically, this is the proactive security that you know today. Basically, you have some vulnerability management, like a vulnerability scanner with some other features that allow you to keep track of all the vulnerabilities that you have on the environment. You try to patch as many as you can, and you implement a bunch of different services for prevention and detection, right? EDR, NDR, HIDs, your firewalls, of course, all the traditional ones, proxies, and that kind of stuff. SIMs to see if you can detect everything. And hopefully those things are working in concert to prevent, or at the very least to detect attacks when they happen. The problem is you only really get a chance to test these once the attack happens. So once the damage is already done. Hopefully everything will be configured correctly, but these are very complex software with a lot of options. So it's very easy to miss something. So where Pantera comes in is that it allows you, sorry, next slide. Pantera is an automated security validation tool. We used to call it automated penetration testing tool, but I like this designation much better. What Pantera allows you to do is to test all of those security, all of your security stack from a top-down approach. So unlike a breach and attack simulation tool, for example, that would allow you to select specific scenarios that you want to run through and everything, Pantera is very opinionated, and it's you let it loose on your environment, and it will perform the attacks and test all of those security controls at once. Now, the advantage of having Pantera, of course, Pantera by itself is great, but it's not a silver bullet because you still need some humor, some specialized work to get into those really hard to reach vulnerabilities or attack chains. So what Pantera allows you to do is continuously test your security controls for the most common techniques used by hackers, by malware, and then something like the synergistic red team can come in and do the overlay attack and basically look at the more complex attacks that require more intricate functionality to make you work. So next slide, please. And this is basically what you would get with the services working together, right? You get some automated security validation that can run as often as you want. Pantera can run daily if you wanted to, or weekly. But what matters here is that it can follow. You can rerun it every time there's a change on your environment. And then you can get those periodic assessments or complementary assessments, I should say, by the synergistic red team to really ensure that you're protected against attacks. So this is just how Pantera in general works. But next we'll talk a little bit about specifically how the ransomware ready module works. This is a new feature of Pantera. And it's something that we're really excited about. So next slide, please. Oh, sorry, I jumped a slide. So this will be our first line of defense. Basically, the idea is you prepare, prevent, detect, and mitigate, and you go through that cycle. But basically, with Pantera and the red team, the idea here is to prepare and not having to go through the rest of the other things, of the other steps. Now, next slide. Okay, so ransomware ready. As I said, a new feature of Pantera. It's eventually going to be integrated into, if you're already familiar with the platform, it's going to be integrated into our black box, gray box scenarios. But right now, it's what we call a targeted test. It's something that runs in somewhat in isolation. So you would tell Pantera, just look for ransomware, perform the ransomware attacks. Next slide. And the way that Pantera does that is by actually emulating the ransomware. So again, if you're not familiar with Pantera, Pantera doesn't have any agents. It's a box that's deployed on the environment that's going to perform the attacks as a real attacker would. Usually hackers are not going to get your permission to install agents on your machines before they can actually perform the attacks, and that's exactly how Pantera will act. For the ransomware ready, there are some differences there where we do use credentials. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, because it's what we call a targeted test. But basically the idea here is Pantera is going to get into a machine and launch the attack. It's going to then inject one of the, the first thing you're going to do is choose actually which campaign you want to emulate. Currently, we support Maze and REvo, but another two more campaigns are coming out really soon. But then Pantera is going to launch the attack. Then it's going to inject the process, do some process hollowing, memory hollowing, and then injecting the process there, execute the payload on the machine, encrypt the real data from the user profile. So basically, again, we're behaving just like the regular malware. It's going to create a shadow copy of the user data, encrypt that, and then it's going to optionally exfiltrate the data. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. You have full control of the exfiltration, of course. It's not exfiltrating to us or anything like that. It's not even exfiltrating real data. It's generating some random data and exfiltrating that. And you can optionally even exfiltrate the data to real IOCs. So you could try to send that random data that Pantera generated to IOCs that are known to be associated with the Maze or REvo campaigns. Again, in that case, to test your EDR solution. But by going through that full workflow, by actually running this, using the same techniques that the malware uses, Pantera would allow you to know, which parts of your security stack are, the weak link. So basically, where are the attacks, should be blocked but are not being blocked on your environment. Next slide. So basically the only part that Pantera doesn't do is the what comes before. So basically the infection of the machine by the that you would receive the malware. So usually it's going to come through some phishing campaign, for example, and it's not within the philosophy of the Pantera tool to do this kind of attacks. It doesn't do phishing attacks or things like that. Plus, whenever you run Pantera, you want a deterministic result. So Pantera needs to be sure that it's going to be able to execute those, at least start the chain of attack on the machine. But otherwise, you can focus on true root vulnerabilities to kind of mitigate how the malware can come into the environment, and then you can use Pantera to verify that the other steps, basically the actual methodology used by the malware, is being detected or blocked by your environment. Next. And then at the, as I mentioned before, Pantera is a one-click exposure. So basically you select a few settings. Once the template is created, you can run it as often as you want. It's agentless. It's actually running the attacks. It's not simulating anything. It's not running, of course, the real malware. It's using the same techniques, but it is safe. I'll mention a little bit. I already talked a little bit about some of the safety features. As I said, it's going to copy the user data. It's going to encrypt that, and then it's going to delete that same data. It's not going to delete the real user data. When it exfiltrates data, it exfiltrates some random data that was generated. So it's safe to run. It doesn't impact your users in any way, because there's some safety behind the scene as well for limiting the number of files that are going to be encrypted, the size of the files that are going to be encrypted, and so on and so forth. So you can run this without without having to worry about impacting user performance at all, aside perhaps from some AV warnings that might pop up. Next. This is we'll look at this in more detail soon, but basically this is what the ransomware emulation looks like on the platform itself. You're going to see step by step what Pantera did on the environment, and you're going to be able to see where your antivirus failed to detect the attack. So on that image there on the left, all those 8.8s there, the little nodes on the left with the red shields, they're all indicating positions where Pantera thinks that the antivirus should have stopped it from acting, but it didn't. So you'll be able to see all of this in the interface itself. Next. And at the end of the Pantera assessment, you would get all of these, I guess, these deliverables. So you can prioritize the achievements based on the true risk. So this is true for every Pantera assessment. When it gives you the results, it's not going to be based on some, when you're looking at results for example, for vulnerabilities that were exploited, it's not going to be based on the CVSS score or something like that, just like a vulnerability scanner would. It's based on the actual attacks. So Pantera is going to tell you, for example, you might have a vulnerability that is a critical vulnerability based on CVSS score, but in reality, it was only Pantera was only able to exploit that to get into a machine that didn't have a lot of interesting information. On the other hand, by sniffing a credential on the network and then performing some in the middle attacks, Pantera was able to get eventually to a domain admin. So in that case, it's going to prioritize that lower CVSS scored vulnerability because the impact is more the impact is higher than the one with the higher CVSS score.
And Nelson, this is, I'll interject real quick. This is one of the powerful things about having a partnership, right? Because from a synergistic side, this is something we would help kind of operationalize and prioritize based upon the risk profile or acceptance of each of those individual organizations, right? And so, that again, that's one of the benefits of having kind of this solution together, is being able to not only identify what the problem is, but then it's not just another thing for an organization to fix. We can help provide and make those actual remediation changes or whatever may be needed in order to circumvent the risk. So I added.
And that's a great point, Ben. The advantage of having Pantera is not that it's going to give you everything on a silver platter. It's still security information. You're still, although it does its best to prioritize things, to explain the vulnerabilities, having an expert go over the results and help put some context around it is still very important, right? I mean, yes, Pantera might tell you, yeah, it's possible to do best-of-hash attacks, but knowing what the impacts are going to be of mitigating that vulnerability by disabling, for example, by implementing a credential guard or something like that, it's something that the CynergisTek will be able to help you with. The Pantera won't be able to give the information. So Pantera actually takes care of the boring stuff that the red team is doing, right? Running the tools and everything. This is something that the red team has to do. Really, the value that comes from running those vulnerability assessments or from the pen test, whatever it is actually on extracting the data and extracting the items that you can take care of. And this is where the red team would come in and really augment what Pantera is doing. And I've seen that. I've seen people just using Pantera by itself and using it with a red team, and you do get it's just much better results when you're using the red team service as well. Everything that Pantera does is aligned to the MITRE attack matrix. So it's Pantera, just like MITRE, cares about techniques. It's not about the vulnerabilities, because I think Ben was mentioning this before. I think the number of 0 days doubled since 2020, right? That were discovered being used in the wild. So even if you're on top of all of your vulnerabilities, chances are there's something that you don't know. There's some unknown that an attacker might be able to leverage to get into the environment. So what Pantera really is trying to show you, and what red teams really show you, it's not just the perimeter, if your perimeter is safe, but whether you can detect the attacks once the attacker is inside the network. So it's really that assume breach mentality, right? Pantera will give you, we'll look at the reports later, but it will give you some information, contextual information about the malware campaign that was run. So we'll talk a little bit about the family itself. You get some remediation steps as well. Although, as Ben mentioned, by having this remediation steps being put into context by a red team is certainly, extremely valuable. Pantera will give you on the report as well, or on the UI, just showing you what hosts were compromised and how far it was able to get for each attack on the different hosts. You get a resilience score, including the encryption, data exfil, achievements, CDR bypass information, all of that. Again, we'll look at the report in a bit. But you also, at the end, of course, you get the endpoint security bypass results. So Pantera will tell you, I detected these specific EDR solutions or AV solutions on these machines, but I was able to bypass it, or it was blocked by that solution, etc.
Awesome. Hey, Nelson, I think we got a couple questions that came in the chat. I'll start with the first one. Do you test lateral movement for east-west protection?
Mm-hmm. So we not on the ransomware ready. The ransomware ready is currently very specific. It says you're going to choose some machines, and Pantera is going to stay on those machines. But yes, Pantera, what we call the black box scenarios or the gray box, the regular templates for Pantera will test lateral movement. So it will do once it gets, let's say, the Pantera is able to either exploit a vulnerability or use a man-in-the-middle attack to get into a box. It's going to try to elevate privileges. If it's able to, then it's going to extract information from the machine. Let's say you can extract the NTLM hashes for a local admin, and let's assume that the local admin has the same password on every machine on the environment, or at least every workstation on the environment. Pantera is then going to use those hashes to do best hash attacks. Also going to try to crack the hashes, but do best hash attacks until it can find, let's say, a machine where there are some domain credentials stored in memory. So, Mimikatz type attack. It's going to try to extract that from the LSS process. And use that. If you can detect the domain, a domain controller in scope, it's going to use those credentials to try to create a domain admin account for itself. So it could do best hash also over LDAP, or again, if it's an LSS, might be able to even get the clear text password for that user. But in any case, it's going to do that. It's going to sync to domain controller, download the full domain controller database, all of that in an automated fashion, as long as it's in scope, and Pantera can get that initial foothold. It will automatically move laterally. But again, this is for the regular template. The targeted testing in general on the Pantera platform, they're very specific. So they will be contained to the machines where Pantera is run, where you pointed Pantera to.
Awesome, thanks. And I think you kind of touched on this, but the other follow-up question to that was, do you simulate AV integration or privilege escalation? Which you kind of touched on.
I didn't hear the first part. So yes, privilege escalation, yes, we do have different techniques.
So do you simulate Active Directory integration or privilege escalation? Yeah,
so to be clear, we don't, Pantera is not simulate. I mean, I know it's kind of pedantic, but it's what we like to make the differentiation. Breach and attack simulation tools are simulating, Pantera is emulating because it's actually performing the attacks, right? It's not telling you, well, you might be vulnerable to this. It's actually running the actual best hash attacks. It's running the privilege escalation attacks, either by exploiting a vulnerability or using some other techniques. For example, we can use RDP to try to escalate privileges, just like a lot of malware do. And it does integrate into Active Directory. And you see, there's also a targeted test on Pantera that allows you to, in that case, you can just give Pantera a password, and Pantera will just connect to the domain controller and crack the hashes that way. But during the attack, during the black box scenarios, if Pantera is able to get in, to get a domain admin by itself, it will automatically use that to connect to domain controller and download all the databases. Plus, a lot of attacks, related to domain controllers and Kerberos as well. Kerber roasting, ASP rec, AS rec, roasting, all the fun stuff.
Awesome, thanks. I think that's all we got.
Okay, cool. All right, so next slide. I think now it's the demo. Yeah, cool. So I will showcase the ransomware emulation on the Pantera platform. I need to, oh, there you go. Google Chrome. All right, so the quintessential question of these days, can you see my screen? You can see my browser in this case. Sorry, can you see my browser?
Oh, sorry, yeah. So we can okay. See the browser and yep.
Awesome.
Sorry, it's nodding my head, but not so
Cool. So this is what we're looking at right now is the targeted testing scenario. So if I go here, actually, Pantera has these different scenarios or testing scenario templates. The black box is what I just mentioned. This is where Pantera really emulate that attacker, the red team, starting from nothing and trying to get to the environment. The what if is similar to the black box, but it would give Pantera information, getting just, what if an attacker knew what they were looking for, or what if an attacker had a credential, something like that. There's the vulnerability assessment, which just runs a vulnerability scan against the environment. But what we're looking at right now is going to be a targeted testing called ransomware emulation, right? So once you select this, it's really straightforward to set it. So give it a name, a description, and then the IP addresses to include on that assessment, okay? And to exclude from the assessment as well. Of course, if you want to just do a full range here and exclude some machines, you can do that as well. The next step is then to give Pantera credential. As I mentioned during the introduction, during the slides, Pantera doesn't do phishing campaigns or anything like that. And eventually, once we integrate the ransomware ready feature to the black box, those attacks are going to be performed automatically as well. So as soon as Pantera can get to a certain machine, it's going to try the same type of attacks, that the ransomware ready is doing. But currently, since this is a targeted testing, you would give Pantera some credentials that it can use to run the attacks on the machines. So again, the idea here is Pantera is trying to validate that what you have to monitor the machine the machine security is up to date and is able to detect the attacks. By the way, Pantera doesn't use this user to disable AV or anything like that. It's just using this user to really execute commands on all of the boxes that you select to be in scope. Next step, select a campaign. As I mentioned, Maze and REvil are the campaigns that are available right now, but we have 2 more coming out in the next month, the next 2 weeks actually. Next is to select encryption. So as I mentioned before, behind the scenes, Pantera does have some controls. For example, it'll only look at the first 150 megs of files on the user profile to encrypt, so to not affect performance. But you can go even further and say, I want the fast encryption mode, or basically Pantera is only going to encrypt the first 100K of the file. Again, what Pantera is doing here is trying to showcase that your EDR solution, trying to test if your EDR solution can detect the behavior. So that behavior doesn't matter if you're encrypting, the whole 5 megs of the file or 100K. Your EDR solution should be able to detect both. So you have the option here of selecting, encryption mode, for example. Files to encrypt. So Pantera is going to, has a built-in list of things that you encrypt by default. You can add some extra extra extensions here, or you can even add custom extensions. This is useful for example, Ben mentioned healthcare. Some other industries, if you might have some specific types of files that are monitored differently by some DLP solution, whatever it is. But if you monitor differently, you can certainly put them here to make sure that they are being detected if something is happening to those files. Approvals. So as Pantera can run completely autonomously, where it doesn't require approval for the actions to run, but you have the option of requiring approvals before, in this case, before Pantera actually goes through the attack on the machine. So you have full control. In this case, if you selected like a full subnet to run Pantera against, you can control which ones Pantera is actually going to try to attack. Data exfiltration. So this is the interesting part, one of the interesting parts, where you can tell Pantera to try to exfiltrate some of the data from the environment. Now, as I mentioned before, exfiltrated, it's not the data from the user. It's not even the encrypted data from the user. It's just some random data that Pantera generates on the machine. It's still going to generate that data. It's going to copy to that shadow. It's going to create a shadow copy of that, and then it's going to try to exfiltrate that. Now you can put your own IP or URL, and Pantera is going to try to do some, post or put requests to those URLs, or you can actually what we call challenge defense and use real IOCs. So the idea here is Pantera is going to use some known IOCs for that specific campaign to to try to exfiltrate that random data. Now, we put this warning here, of course, because even though the data itself is not real, some of those IOCs might still be alive, and they will, at the very least detect there's some connection coming from your external IP address. So you might call attention to yourself. So we put a little warning here, but this is a great way to make sure that your NDR solution, for example, can detect this type of behavior. And then scheduling and duration, again, this is the advantage of having a tool to do your vulnerability assessment, is that you can run it as often as you want. Awesome. So let's take a look at what the actual run looks like. And this is a Pantera, the overview panel for Pantera. So this is specific to the ransomware. Sorry, this is generic. This is what it looks like for black box or anything else. But what we're looking at right now is a ransomware ready run of Pantera, specifically against the using the Maze campaign. On the left, we see all of the achievements Pantera got. So you can see, for example, in one host, it was able to complete the ransomware attack kill chain. On 14 hosts, it was able to. The kill chain was interrupted at some point. And we can see, for the other achievements here, basically Pantera will list all of the times that it was able to get you through some of these achievements. Here we just see a quick list of the achievements Pantera got. The approvals tab, as I said, you will be able to then approve before Pantera run the emulation on each one of these boxes. This is a little different when you're running Pantera on the black box. The approvals would be not just for the general attack, but it would be for things like, can I extract credential from memories? Can I exploit this pre-nightmare, whatever? It would all show up on approvals here. But for the ransomware ready, it's actually just kind of a more generic thing, just saying, can I start the attack against this machine or not? And then finally, on the bottom here, we see the actual machines Pantera found on the environment and the types of finds that he had on each one of them. So you can actually click on the box itself to get some information about that. So what was Pantera able to run in there? Ports open, roles for the machine, and then if Pantera detected any antivirus on that machine. But now to the interesting part, the attack map. So we saw the attack map a little bit on the slides, but this is what Pantera is going to show for that run of the ransomware. So what we're looking at here is a completed ransomware attack queue chain on a certain host. In this case, the host is 111.3. So I'm going to zoom in here a little bit. So you see the first thing is Pantera validated the credentials that we gave it, right? So Pantera is validating the credentials. By the way, by default, Pantera doesn't actually show the password, it masks them, but I made a settings change to actually show everything. Pantera validates the credentials. It then tests the credential against different machines. So you can see here that credential specifically worked on these 4 machines over here, okay? So we can see Pantera used different protocols to test that, but in any case, it did work on all 4. Pantera then takes 2 different paths on this box, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but I'm going to follow this path here, where Pantera is saying that they open a remote control channel to the box. So this is just running PSSX type thing, where Pantera is now able to issue some commands against that box. That allowed it to execute some code remotely. So in this case, as you can see, it's using bitsadmin. Bitsadmin is, of course, a tool from the Windows Update, I guess, pseudo solution or whatever, but it's part of the Windows Update process. But bitsadmin does allow you to download files from the internet, kind of a poor man's wget. It then allowed Pantera then made the request to download this file here, as you can see, to the local box. Pantera then is showing that, yeah, the first thing is that a payload was the payload, the bitsadmin, established a connection back to the Pantera box. We see here a reverse connection on this port to the Pantera box. And that allowed Pantera to then upload a malware to the host. So what we're emulating in this point here, up to this point here, is some either social engineering attack or phishing attack or something like that, that would allow that first stage to happen, which is to use a living off the land attack, right? So just using tools that are available on the Windows box to download the first stage of the malware, which incidentally this kind of is going to be the actual dropper for the real malware. In any case, what Pantera is saying here is, look, at this point, an antivirus should have blocked me because this is a malware file, right? So we can see here where the file was placed, the name, the file name, and then how Pantera was able to download that file. Now, eventually, now that this path joined with this other one. So what we can see here is Pantera also followed this other path here to get to this 3.3. Again, it's just open a remote control channel to the box. But this is now using PSSX to just upload the malware directly to the box without having to go through bitsadmin. The idea here is, well, even if the AV blocked it, blocked this step, we still want to continue with the test. So Pantera is trying to do both things at the same time, but at the end, it runs the same file against that environment. So this executable here. As I mentioned, this executable is actually a dropper. So what it does is, again, it connects back to the Pantera box. And by the way, this is all happening within your environment. The Pantera box is sitting locally on your environment. It's not a SaaS solution or anything like that. It can be deployed on the cloud, but you still have to have VPN connection between Pantera and your environment. So for all intents and purposes, this is internal to your environment. But Pantera would create a reverse session to the box, the client would create that reverse session to the Pantera box. Pantera would then inject a .NET assembly to remote process. So basically, it just does some process memory hollowing, injects the process into the executable into that process, and then it runs that. This is the actual malware. This is the actual maze component of Pantera, of the attack. Next step should then generate an encryption key. So we can see here the actual encryption key, or the base64 for the hex string that was used to generate the for the byte string, I should say, not hex string, for the byte string they used to generate the key. And then the algorithm used, which is Salsa 20. Again, this algorithm is going to be the same used by, in this case, the maze family. Pantera then enumerate the files on the host. So it's the way that Pantera performed the attack is that it looks for the last logged on user or the user that's currently logged into the box, and that's going to be the victim of the attack. This is just a lab machine, so we only had a single file there that was put in there just to showcase this. But Pantera saw that the user had this file on their downloads folder. Pantera then proceeded to encrypt the file. So we actually see the encryption algorithm that Pantera used, the method which we control, as I remember from the setup page. And this is the actual encrypted file. This is now a shadow copy inside this directory. So the user wouldn't be able to see it. Well, not by normal means anyway, not with Windows Explorer or anything like that. You have to run specific commands to actually see that shadow file. Pantera is now saying, oh, the AV should have blocked this step as well. Now, just perform the encryption and place it on the shadow file. This is extremely suspicious, so your AV should have blocked it. The next step is to emulate the shadow copy deletion. So basically, Pantera is using this WMIC to erase the shadow copy file. Again, Pantera is saying this is not something that users would normally do, so your EDR solution should be able to detect, or should have detected and blocked this from happening, but it didn't, so Pantera got to the final achievement, which is to complete the ransomware attack. All right, that was a lot of me talking. Promise I'll be brief, there's not a lot left, but basically, Pantera will also show you here some of the chains that were interrupted. So you can see here, for example, on this machine on 110.2, after generating the key, ransomware queue chain was interrupted. So when it tried to actually encrypt the file, Pantera was able, whatever solution was in that box was able to stop the chain. But one thing to note though is that Pantera was still able to upload the file there. So Pantera injected that file that has some malicious behavior on it and everything. So if your solution is claiming to look at behavior of the downloaded files and not at signatures, then you might have to do some tuning or maybe look at some other tool, because yes, the attack itself was stopped, but Pantera was still able to download that file to the system without being blocked. And again, Pantera will show you this for all of the different machines. These machines have Windows Defender, and we know that Windows Defender does exactly that. When it stops it on the at the step that is actually encrypting the file, but it doesn't stop the dropper from being downloaded. Okay, so some of the other views here that Pantera has, you can have a host-centric view, where Pantera can click on it, and again, it will show you the achievements, services running on the box, and everything related to that specific host. The actions log is the most boring of the tabs. It just shows all of the attacks on this kind of CSV-like format, and you can actually download this as a CSV, but it goes through all the attacks step by step. Oh, Pantera will just say, I just started this attack, I was successful, wasn't successful. It's great for extracting information and parsing. This is actually, you can connect Pantera also to a syslog server, or even if that syslog server is a listener, data fields to Ceph or Leaf format. But the cool thing about doing that is that while the attacks are happening, you can compare on your SIM, you can look at your SIM and say, all right, this attack is happening, I can see it right now on my SIM. Do I see the detections coming in from my defense tools at the same time? So really interesting use cases that you have there. Again, everything that we do is aligned to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So we overlay the findings to the MITRE ATT&CK matrix here. Footprints, of course, during the course of the assessment, vendor is going to create a bunch of files on the environment, usually the droppers, right, or the encrypted files. And then at the end, Pantera is going to try to delete those files and services that it might have created. And then finally, the report. So this is the report Pantera generates. You can download it as a CSV file, sorry, as a PDF file. But it's going to have all the information about the attack. So, I already talked through this during the slides. Pantera is going to show the techniques or the approach that it takes to emulating the ransomware. Then it's going to talk a little bit about the ransomware family itself. So what the attackers behind Maze, the APT behind Maze is about, kind of attributions, that kind of stuff. An executive summary. So if you run Pantera, the same assessment, over time, Pantera will give you a resilience score for the environment. And it's also going to show you here for the different categories like payload launch, file enumeration, how many times Pantera is able to bypass. So the success rate for Pantera. As I mentioned, Pantera will showcase if it can detect what antivirus is installed on a machine or EDR solution. It's going to show here. So Pantera is saying, yeah, my Defender ATP was installed on 12 hosts, and on none of those was Pantera able to bypass to completely bypass this. But then when no AV or EDR was installed, Pantera was able to bypass it all the time. That seems pretty obvious, of course, but encryption. So here we see the encryption. If Pantera had encrypted multiple files, you would see here which files were encrypted, what kind of files Pantera found in the environment, on the environment. The achievements, the Pantera was able to get on that run, and then of course the MITRE attack matrix as well. Finally, Pantera will show some information about some more technical information about the campaign. So some general guidelines on how to mitigate some of the things that Maze does. Again, it's not going to say things like, well, for example, REvil right a few weeks ago came out that they were using Pre-Nightmare actively. So this is not what Pantera is going to talk about. It just talks generally about patching early and often, disabling RDP, filtering emails. So it's more generic information about what you can do to help mitigate these things, but not about specific vulnerabilities. And then of course,
I'll jump in real quick, Nelson. So from a synergistic perspective, right? So we help operationalize the findings, and sometimes these tactical or strategic findings often are the result of a much larger change that needs to happen. And so as we kind of work with the organization and understand, did they fall subject to Maze, we'll do an executive briefing and provide all of the threat intel that we might have for the particular variant that you fell victim to, et cetera. So this is a great base, and it's something that from a synergistic standpoint that we just look to add on as we try and solve kind of those systemic issues that led us to this point of being able to be compromised.
Cool. Yeah. And here Pantera will again just give you some information about the IOCs used and everything, but as Ben mentioned, having the red team here analyze and interpret this information for you is extremely helpful. Pantera also has this built-in wiki that actually applies to all the different attacks that Pantera can perform, performs. So we can see here for different things like ARP poisoning, living off the land binaries, that kind of stuff. So every category is going to be here. But Pantera will give you some specific information about that malware, API calls used by that, and then of course some IOCs associated with it, right? So hashes associated with Maze, YADA rules, and then URLs associated, known to belong to Maze. So this is, Pantera, or the ransomware ready feature in a nutshell. Any questions?
We do have a couple that we'll run through real quick. But again, Nelson, I really do appreciate you taking the time to kind of walk through the specific module as it relates to ransomware and how the Pantera solution can really provide great insight into whether or not an organization is going to be susceptible to various types of ransomware, especially from a tactical perspective. And I think from my perspective, that attack chain that we walk through, right, is very powerful because it starts to highlight areas and issues where you may not have had visibility because of the current technology or tools that organizations are using are only seeing that first phase. So really being able to understand what the impact is from some, whether it's ransomware or some other type of attack, I think is incredibly powerful in terms of being able to be better prepared against all threats. So a couple of questions that came in, I think they're pretty generic, so let me just go and look. So the first question that came in is do you guys help with remediation? So generally speaking, it looks like from, when there are findings that have been identified within this process, then absolutely CynergisTek can help kind of guide and build out the strategy needed in order to solve like kind of those systemic problems. Sometimes they're tactical, as in, remove a box, patch this. Sometimes they're much larger initiatives, right, that you may need to implement a PAM solution or equivalent. And so those are really on a case-by-case basis. But ultimately, our goal as a partner is really to kind of help guide you in those decisions. So something, between the two of us, we absolutely do. Another question is, does this replace annual pen testing? No, I wouldn't say it does. I would say in general, this is an additional mechanism to be better prepared for those type of assessments, right? Annual pen testing, red teaming, like they're great and they provide a lot of value. They don't provide a lot of value if you're not doing the basic blocking and tackling all year round, right? So whether you're running specific ransomware scenarios or using the larger black box portion of Pantera, I think will give you an incredibly leg up and make those types of assessments more difficult for your third-party auditors, which means that they're going to look in places they don't normally look, which should provide you with an even better picture of risk, right? Having done pen testing for probably 20 years or so, it's a lot of the same organizations fall subject to the same types of problems year in and year out because they're not being able to manage their resources effectively. Or their prioritization. They don't even know what the prioritization changes day in and day out. And so with the Pantera platform and the red team, right, kind of looking at this from a continuous basis, you have this dynamic view of your environment and know, hey, we're able to exploit this. We need to go and solve this immediately versus kind of having that theoretical view. And I think that's Lauren or Carrie. Did I miss any other questions? I'll turn it over. I think that's it. Awesome. Nelson, any last words?
No, that sounds ominous. No,
I guess for the next 7 minutes, we'll give everybody back. But
no, I just want to thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to showcase Pantera here, and I really think this is an amazing partnership. To be able to, as I said, you really get the most value out of Pantera if you have someone to see the results, you help interpret them. Yeah, and I'm really glad you guys invited me to be here today.
Appreciate everybody. Have a fantastic afternoon.
Sorry, this real fast. This is Carrie Mulcahy. I just wanted to let the audience know, first of all, thank you for attending, and that we are available for any questions. Another like deep dive demo if it's available. We are running a special promotion for our what we are calling continuous pen testing service. So that includes the Pantera tool and our red teaming. So if you're interested, please reach out to one of your CTech contacts after the call. Thank you very much.